Some people are so good at telling a story that you can't help but listen. Now, I'm not one of those people, but like the rest of us, I can appreciate a good story. So this is a tale of a man who was both an amazing storyteller and songwriter, and who became world famous, but at a cost. Waiting in the office, Gilbert O'Sullivan had no reason to expect that the manager, Gordon Mills, would give him a recording contract. Gilbert was 23 years old, he looked nothing like the successful acts of the day, and he had no hit records to his name at all. The only thing keeping him waiting in that office was his obsession with music. His heart must have absolutely leapt when the man who had signed Tom Jones and Engelbert Humperdinck agreed to give him a recording contract. What a spring in his step when he left that office. So how, a few years later, did Gilbert O'Sullivan end up in another office, trying to break up the very agreement that he'd been waiting his whole life up to that point to receive? In the intervening period, he'd become world famous. His records were for sale in every shop. He was a staple of the music industry awards, and he couldn't go out onto the street without being recognised. It was all a product of Gilbert's amazing talent for music and his manager Gordon Mills' talent for business. So what could cause a man who had got everything he'd ever wanted to break up the very relationship that had got it for him? Well, it turned out that Gilbert hadn't got everything that he wanted. The thing that was most important to him, his music, had been signed away to a number of companies owned by the manager Gordon Mills. When there was money to be made, it was the companies that got the biggest slice. When Gilbert's music was in demand, it was the companies that sold it. And when the profits were shared out, it was not Gilbert who received the lion's share or even 50%. It was Mr. Gordon Mills and a business associate of his, Mr. Smith. But it was not just the money that Gilbert was after. The thing that he really wanted was control of his own work. Gordon Mills' company had not just control of the cash flow, they also had the copyrights and the master tapes. Now, at this point, I was going to break up the story a little by showing you some of Gilbert's genius in the form of his lyrics, which I was going to read out. But luckily for you, I thought the better of that idea, having realised that this entire video is about respecting the rights of the artist's copyright. So instead, I'll just tell you that I make these videos for interest, not for publicity and not for profit. I haven't actually told anyone I know that I'm making them, which is why I film them before work every day. If you're enjoying hearing the stories, or if you're interested in law or music, then please consider clicking the subscribe button. It really helps me out by telling YouTube that people are enjoying what I'm doing. It also lets you be notified by YouTube when I release another video, and best of all, it's completely free. Thank you. So Gilbert was looking for control of his music to be restored to him. His solicitor leant back in his chair and thought hard about it. Asking to get out of a contract like that was a serious matter, especially when the contract had been written long before even some of Gilbert's best songs. The reason why contracts are such a serious business is because they're basically the foundation on which all business in the UK relies. Imagine if I'm a supermarket and I agree to buy 1 million potatoes from a farmer ready for 2026. The farmer will ramp up his production. He'll hire farmhands, he'll hire machinery, and he'll buy whatever seed potatoes and fertilizer he needs to get that kind of crop. If 2026 rolls around and I say, actually, on second thoughts, I don't want your potatoes anymore, just forget about that contract that we made. The farmer would be left with 1 million potentially useless potatoes that he might never be able to sell, and he already would have incurred all of the costs in producing them. It's quite likely that the farmer would be so far out of pocket that he would probably go bankrupt. This would put off all other farmers, or indeed anyone at all in the UK, from ever doing risky deals with each other, or for speculating about future crops or future products, because the risk that they would go bankrupt when their business partner decided to ignore the contract they'd agreed to would be simply too great. For that reason, in a contract situation where both parties have made a lawful agreement with each other, the law will step in if one party tries to get out of the contract later on. The courts will say, we won't let you go back on your promise. You agreed in the correct legal format with this other person, and if you now try and go back on it, that's not fair. We'll stop you from doing that. But one thought that occurred to the solicitor for Gilbert O'Sullivan: had the contract been made in the correct legal format? Now, generally, what a contract requires in English law is somebody to make an offer, somebody to accept that offer, and for there to be an exchange of something valuable to kind of seal the contract. However, there is another important aspect, and that is that the parties need to have validly agreed to what they promised to do. In cases before Gilbert O'Sullivan's, it had been proved that a contract could be avoided if it was proved that somebody had been forced to do something that they hadn't really meant to agree to. Gilbert's lawyers wondered, what if they could argue that Gilbert had been forced, not by any threat of violence or anything like that, but simply because he was very, very young at the time he agreed to this contract. Gordon Mills was promising everything that a young man could ever want from the music industry. Gilbert trusted Gordon Mills implicitly. Would that be enough to set aside the contract? Well, the court in that case, as it turned out, agreed with Gilbert and his lawyers. There had been no threat of violence. There had been quite a significant inequality of bargaining power, however, and Gilbert had been promised something that, as he said himself later on, at the time he would have signed anything. The court said Gordon Mills and his companies and his associates were entitled to a fair share of the profits, given the amount of talent and skill that Gordon had put into promoting Gilbert's business. However, a large section of the royalties due to him were returned to Gilbert, and best of all, and the thing that he was really after, the master tapes of his recordings and the copyrights were delivered back to him. So that's how one songwriter made not just musical history, but legal history too. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thanks for watching.